Captain Sarah Chun had always been different from other pilots. While her fellow aviators talked about glory and combat records, she focused on precision and saving lives. Her hands never shook when missiles screamed past her fighter jet. Her voice never wavered when calling in airstrikes to protect ground troops. But today, standing in the briefing room of Naval Special Warfare Command, she felt something she had not experienced in 8 years of military service: genuine nervousness. The room smelled like strong coffee and stress. Maps covered every wall, marked with red zones that meant danger and blue zones that meant friendly territory. 3 dozen of the Navy's most elite warriors sat in metal chairs, their faces hard and focused. These were SEALs, the kind of soldiers who jumped out of helicopters at midnight and completed impossible missions. Sarah was the only woman in the room, and one of only 5 Air Force personnel among a sea of Navy uniforms. "We need battle pilots," Captain Marcus Rodriguez announced from behind podium. His voice carried the authority of someone who had led men through countless dangerous operations. Not just any pilots. We need aviators who can think like ground fighters. People who understand that every bullet they fire might save the life of someone fighting on the dirt. Sarah shifted in her seat. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but most of her work involved high-altitude bombing runs and air superiority missions. What Captain Rodriguez was describing sounded different. More personal, more dangerous. "This operation will take place in the mountains of Afghanistan," Rodriguez continued, clicking a remote that brought up satellite images on the large screen behind him. "The terrain is rough. The weather is unpredictable. The enemy knows we are coming, and they have prepared for months to kill us." The satellite photos showed jagged peaks covered in snow, deep valleys that looked like scars in the earth, and tiny villages scattered across the landscape like dots on a map. Sarah had flown over similar territory before, but she had always been 30,000 feet above it, safe in her cockpit with plenty of fuel and clear skies. Looking at these images, she realized this mission would be nothing like her previous assignments. Intel reports indicate that a terrorist cell has captured 3 American contractors, Rodriguez said. His voice grew colder with each word. "These are not soldiers. They are engineers who are building schools and hospitals for Afghan children. The terrorists are holding them in a compound that sits on top of a mountain ridge, surrounded by caves and defensive positions." Sarah leaned forward in her chair. The tactical challenge was immediately clear to her pilot-trained mind. The compound sat in a position where traditional air support would be nearly useless. The surrounding peaks would interfere with targeting systems. The caves provided perfect cover for enemy fighters. Any rescue attempt would require aircraft that could operate in extremely tight spaces with minimal room for error. "We have tried negotiating," Rodriguez continued. "We have tried diplomatic pressure. We have tried economic sanctions. None of it has worked. The terrorists want to execute these Americans on live television in 72 hours. That gives us 3 days to plan, infiltrate, and extract our people." A SEAL in the front row raised his hand. "What kind of air support are we looking at, Captain?" Rodriguez turned towards Sarah and the other pilots. "That is where our aviators come in. We need close air support that can operate in mountain valleys. We need pilots who can fly low and slow, who can put ordnance exactly where we need it, when we need it. We need people who understand that they will be flying into the most dangerous airspace in Afghanistan." Sarah felt her heart rate increase. Everything about this mission sounded like a recipe for disaster. Mountain flying was dangerous even in perfect conditions. Combat flying in mountains was exponentially worse. The air was thin, which reduced aircraft performance. The terrain created unpredictable wind patterns. Enemy fighters could hide in caves and pop out with surface-to-air missiles at any moment. But as she listened to Rodriguez describe the captured Americans, she thought about something her flight instructor had told her years ago. He had said that being a military pilot was not about being the best stick and rudder aviator. It was about being willing to put your aircraft and your life on the line for people you might never meet. It was about understanding that your job was not to come home with clean underwear and a perfect safety record. Your job was to make sure other people got to go home to their families. The terrain analysis shows multiple approach routes, Rodriguez said, bringing up a new set of images. But each one presents unique challenges. The northern approach requires flying through a valley that is only 300 meters wide at its narrowest point. The southern approach involves crossing a ridgeline that puts aircraft in range of known anti-aircraft positions. The eastern approach requires flying at night, in weather, through mountain passes that have killed experienced pilots in peacetime. Sarah studied the images carefully. Her tactical training kicked in automatically, analyzing wind patterns, elevation changes, and potential threats. The mission was not impossible, but it would require the kind of flying that separated competent pilots from exceptional ones. It would require aviators who could think 3 moves ahead while flying 50 feet above the ground at 200 miles per hour. "We need volunteers," Rodriguez announced. "This is not an assignment. This is a request for people who are willing to risk everything to save the lives of 3 Americans who chose to spend their time building schools instead of making money in comfortable offices back home." The room fell silent. Sarah could hear the ventilation system humming overhead and the distant sound of helicopters taking off from the flight line outside. She looked around at the faces of the SEALs surrounding her. These are people who had volunteered for the most dangerous job in the military. They jumped out of airplanes into hostile territory. They swam underwater for miles to reach enemy beaches. They climbed mountains and crossed deserts and fought in places where normal soldiers could not survive. If they were willing to risk their lives for 3 strangers, how could she do any less? Sarah slowly stood up from her chair. The sound of the metal legs scraping against the concrete floor seemed impossibly loud in the quiet room. Every eye turned toward her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. "I volunteer," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she had expected. Rodriguez nodded once, a slight smile crossing his face. "Outstanding. What is your background, Lieutenant?" "Lieutenant Sarah Chun, United States Air Force," she replied. 8 years of service, 3 years of combat experience. I have flown F-16s in Iraq and Afghanistan. I have logged over 2,000 hours in combat zones and completed 47 combat missions without losing an aircraft or failing to complete an objective. Any mountain flying experience? Sarah hesitated for just a moment. She had trained in mountain flying during her initial pilot training, but most of her combat experience had been in the relatively flat terrain of Iraq and the lower elevations of eastern Afghanistan. But she had always been a quick learner, and she understood aircraft performance better than most pilots. "Limited mountain experience in combat conditions," she admitted, "but I have extensive low-level flying experience, and I understand the performance characteristics of close air support aircraft. I can learn whatever I need to learn." Another pilot stood up. Then another. Within 5 minutes, all 5 Air Force personnel in the room had volunteered for the mission. But Sarah noticed that Rodriguez kept looking at her with an expression she could not quite read. "The mission will require split-second timing," Rodriguez explained. "Our ground team will infiltrate the compound at dawn on day 3. They will have approximately 15 minutes to locate and extract the hostages before enemy reinforcements arrive. During those 15 minutes, our pilots will need to provide close air support that keeps the escape route open while avoiding friendly fire casualties." Sarah began to understand why this mission required volunteers. 15 minutes was not very long in a firefight. When bullets were flying and explosions were going off, 15 minutes could feel like 15 hours or 15 seconds, depending on your perspective. The pilots would need to stay close enough to provide immediate support, but far enough away to avoid becoming targets themselves. "What aircraft will we be flying?" asked one of the other pilots. "10 Thunderbolts," Rodriguez replied. "Close air support aircraft designed for exactly this type of mission. Heavily armored, capable of carrying a variety of ordnance, and able to operate from short runways in rough conditions." Sarah had never flown an A-10, but she knew its reputation. The aircraft was built around its massive Gu-8 cannon, which could fire armor-piercing rounds at a rate of 4,000 rounds per minute. It was slow compared to fighters like her F-16, but it was tough and reliable. A-10 pilot called their aircraft warthogs because they were not pretty, but they got the job done. Training begins tomorrow at 0600, Rodriguez announced. We have 3 days to turn you fighter pilots into close air support specialists. We have 3 days to coordinate air and ground operations in some of the most challenging terrain on Earth. We have 3 days to prepare for a mission that will either save 3 American lives or kill everyone involved. As the briefing ended and the SEALs filed out of the room, Sarah remained in her seat for a moment longer. She thought about the captured Americans sitting in a mountain compound, probably scared and wondering if anyone was coming to help them. She thought about the terrorists who had taken them, people who believed that killing innocent engineers would somehow advance their cause. She thought about the SEALs who were willing to climb mountains and fight through caves to rescue people they had never met. Most of all, she thought about the promise she had made to herself when she first put on a military uniform. She had promised to serve something bigger than herself. She had promised to protect people who could not protect themselves. She had promised to be brave when bravery was required, and skilled when skill meant the difference between life and death. Tomorrow, she would begin learning how to fly an aircraft she had never touched before. She would master tactics she had never practiced. She would prepare for a mission that could easily kill her and everyone around her. But tonight, she would call her parents and tell them she loved them. She would write letters to be opened in case she did not come home. She would check her equipment and study the terrain photos and think through every possible scenario that might unfold in the mountains of Afghanistan. Because somewhere in those mountains, 3 Americans were counting on people they had never met to risk everything for their freedom. And Sarah Chun had never walked away from that kind of responsibility in her life. She stood up from her chair and walked toward the door, her footsteps echoing in the empty briefing room. Outside, she could hear the sound of aircraft engines and helicopter rotors, the constant background noise of a military base preparing for war. In 3 days, she would add her own aircraft to that symphony of preparation and determination. The mission ahead was dangerous. The odds were not good. The terrain was unforgiving and the enemy was prepared. But Sarah Chun was a United States Air Force pilot, and she had never met a challenge that could not be overcome with enough skill, preparation, and courage. The real work was about to begin. The alarm clock screamed at 0530, but Sarah Chun was already awake. She had been lying in her bunk for the past hour, staring at the ceiling and running through aircraft systems checks in her mind. Today was her first day flying the A-10 Thunderbolt, and she wanted to be mentally prepared for every switch, every gauge, and every emergency procedure before she even stepped into the cockpit. The shower water was cold, which helped wake her up completely. As she got dressed in her flight suit, Sarah could hear other pilots moving around in the adjacent rooms. Everyone was up early, everyone was nervous, and everyone was trying not to show it. The mission was still 2 days away, but the training would determine whether they lived or died when those 2 days were over. Sarah made her way to the flight line as the sun was just beginning to appear over the eastern mountains. The air was crisp and thin at this altitude, and her breath came out in small clouds as she walked. Afghanistan was a country of extremes, blazing hot during the day, freezing cold at night, and always unpredictable. The A-10 Thunderbolt was not a beautiful aircraft. Where her F-16 was sleek and graceful, the A-10 was blunt and functional. It looked like someone had designed it with a ruler and a hammer instead of wind tunnel testing and aerodynamic modeling. The massive nose housed the Gu-8 cannon, which was so large that the rest of the aircraft had essentially been built around it. The engines were mounted high and far back, protected from ground fire and debris. The cockpit sat in a titanium bathtub designed to keep the pilot alive even if everything else was shot to pieces. "Not exactly a sports car, is she?" said a voice behind her. Sarah turned to see Major David Brooks, an A-10 pilot with over 15 years of experience flying close air support missions. He was assigned to train the volunteer pilots in the 3 days they had available. His face was weathered from years of desert sun, and his eyes had the calm confidence that came from surviving hundreds of combat missions. "She looks like she means business," Sarah replied. "That she does," Brooks agreed. The A-10 was designed for one purpose: to kill tanks and support ground troops. Everything else is secondary. She is slow, she is loud, and she is not going to win any beauty contests. But when soldiers on the ground need help, there is no better aircraft in the world. Brooks led Sarah through the pre-flight inspection, explaining each system as they went. The A-10 was more complicated than it looked. The aircraft carried 11 external hardpoints that could be loaded with a variety of weapons: bombs, missiles, rockets, and additional cannon ammunition. The pilot had to understand not just how to fly the aircraft, but how to employ each weapon system effectively in rapidly changing tactical situations. "The most important thing to remember," Brooks explained as they climbed into the cockpit, "is that close air support is not about the aircraft. It is about the people on the ground who are counting on you. Your job is not to be a hero. Your job is not to get the most kills or drop the biggest bombs. Your job is to keep American soldiers alive so they can complete their mission and go home to their families." Sarah strapped herself into the ejection seat and began running through the startup procedures. The A-10's cockpit was cramped compared to her F-16, with instruments and switches covering every available surface. But as she went through the checklist, she began to appreciate the aircraft's design philosophy. Everything was within easy reach. Every important system had backup systems. Every switch and gauge was positioned where a pilot could find it quickly, even while pulling G-forces or taking enemy fire. "Engine start," Brooks instructed from the rear seat. Sarah pressed the starter switch and listened as the twin turbofan engines spooled up with a rising whine. The A-10 did not have the raw power of fighter aircraft, but the engines were reliable and fuel efficient. This was an aircraft designed for long missions over contested territory, not short sprints at maximum afterburner. "Tower, this is Hawkeye 1 requesting taxi clearance for training flight," Sarah called over the radio. "Hawkeye 1, clear to taxi runway 27. Wind is calm. Altimeter 292. Sarah released the brakes and gently applied power. The A-10 rolled forward with a rumbling sound that was completely different from the high-pitched whine of her F-16. Everything about this aircraft was more deliberate, more purposeful. It did not accelerate quickly, but it felt solid and stable as it moved across the taxiway. "Take your time," Brooks advised as they approached the runway. The A-10 does not like to be rushed. She'll do everything you ask her to do, but she wants you to ask politely. Sarah lined up on the runway center line and slowly advanced the throttles to full power. The acceleration was gradual compared to a fighter aircraft, but steady and predictable. At rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick and felt the aircraft lift off smoothly. The climb rate was not impressive, but the A-10 felt incredibly stable and controllable. First lesson, Brooks said once they had reached their training altitude: energy management. The A-10 does not have excess power to waste. Everything you do must be planned in advance. If you get slow and low in the wrong place, you're not going to be able to power your way out of trouble like you can in a fighter. For the next 2 hours, Brooks put Sarah through a series of basic maneuvers designed to familiarize her with the aircraft's handling characteristics. The A-10 was forgiving and predictable, but it required a different flying technique than anything she had experienced before. Where her F-16 responded instantly to control inputs, the A-10 took time to build momentum. Where her fighter could change directions abruptly, the A-10 preferred smooth, deliberate control movements. "Now we're going to practice some basic close air support tactics," Brooks announced as they flew toward the training range. "The key to CAS is situational awareness. You need to know where every friendly unit is located, where the enemies are, and where the safe escape routes are. You need to be able to process radio calls from ground controllers while flying the aircraft, selecting weapons, and avoiding threats. The training range was set up to simulate the mountain terrain they would encounter on the actual mission. Wooden targets represented enemy positions. Electronic sensors simulated friendly troops that had to be protected from friendly fire. Radio operators on the ground played the role of forward air controllers, providing targeting information and coordinating attacks. Hawkeye 1, this is Python 6, came a voice over the radio. We have enemy personnel in bunkers approximately 200 meters north of our position. Can you provide close air support to suppress those positions? Sarah looked down at the training range, trying to identify the targets the ground controller was describing. From 3,000 feet altitude, everything looked small and indistinct. She could see the general area where the friendlies were located, but picking out specific enemy positions was more challenging than she had expected. Remember, Brooks coached, take your time to positively identify the target before you shoot. The worst thing you can do in close air support is kill your own people. It is better to take an extra 30 seconds to be sure than to make a mistake that gets American soldiers killed. Sarah rolled the aircraft into a gentle left turn, positioning herself for an attack run on the suspected enemy positions. She selected high-explosive rockets from her weapons panel and armed the firing system. The A-10's heads-up display showed targeting information, but she still had to visually acquire the target before she could engage. Python 6, Hawkeye 1 has visual on suspected enemy positions. Confirm you're clear of the target area. Hawkeye 1, Python 6 confirms we are clear. You're cleared hot. Sarah lined up her attack run and fired a pair of rockets at the training targets. The aircraft shuddered slightly as the rockets left their rails, but remained stable and controllable. She immediately began a climbing turn to avoid any simulated enemy fire and to position herself for additional attacks if required. Good hit, Hawkeye 1, called the ground controller. Target is neutralized. Nice shooting. But Brooks was not satisfied with just one successful attack. For the rest of the morning, he put Sarah through increasingly complex scenarios. Multiple targets. Friendly forces scattered across the battlefield. Simulated enemy air defenses that required her to change tactics and approach routes. Radio communications from multiple ground units requesting different types of support. By the time they returned to base for lunch, Sarah felt mentally exhausted. Flying close air support was completely different from the air-to-air combat missions she was used to. Fighter combat was fast and violent, but relatively simple in terms of decision-making. You found enemy aircraft, you shot them down, and you try not to get shot down yourself. Close air support required juggling multiple priorities while maintaining precise control of the aircraft in dangerous airspace. How did I do? Sarah asked as they climbed down from the cockpit. Better than most fighter pilots on their first day in the Warthog, Brooks replied honestly. But you are still thinking like a fighter pilot. You want to make everything happen quickly. Close air support is about patience and precision, not speed and aggression. That afternoon, they flew again. This time, Brooks introduced Sarah to the A-10's most distinctive weapon, the GU-8 cannon. The 30mm cannon was capable of firing armor-piercing rounds at an incredible rate, but it required careful technique to use effectively. The cannon had a lot of recoil, Brooks explained as they flew toward the gunnery range. When you fire it, the aircraft will slow down and the nose will pitch up. You need to be ready for that and compensate with your flight controls. Also, the cannon is only effective at relatively close range. You need to get within a mile of your target to be accurate, which puts you well within range of small arms fire and portable air defense missiles. Sarah set up her first gunnery pass, diving toward a target tank on the range below. At the appropriate range, she pressed the trigger and felt the aircraft shudder as the massive cannon fired. The sound was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a deep, tearing roar that seemed to shake the entire airframe. Bright flashes from a muzzle created a strobe effect in her peripheral vision. The aircraft immediately began to slow and pitch up exactly as Brooks had warned. Keep the trigger pressed until you see impacts on target, Brooks instructed. The first few rounds are just finding the range. The killing happens in the last half second of your burst. Sarah adjusted her aim and fired again. This time she was ready for the recoil and maintained better aircraft control. She could see her rounds impacting around the target tank, sending up clouds of dust and debris. The effectiveness was impressive. The 30mm rounds could penetrate armor that would stop smaller caliber weapons. They spent the rest of the afternoon practicing different attack techniques. High-angle attacks from above the target. Low-angle attacks that approached the target from the side. Pop-up attacks where the aircraft stayed low until the last moment, then climbed rapidly to attack and escape. Each technique had advantages and disadvantages depending on the tactical situation and the types of threats present. As the sun was setting, they flew back to base for Sarah's final training flight of the day. But instead of landing immediately, Brooks directed her to a section of desert that had been marked off for night flying practice. The actual mission will take place at dawn, Brooks explained. That means you will be taking off in darkness and flying in low-light conditions. Night flying in mountains is extremely dangerous, even without people shooting at you. You need to understand how to use your night vision equipment and how to maintain situational awareness when you cannot see the terrain clearly. Sarah had flown night missions before, but always at high altitude where terrain was not a factor. Flying at low altitude in mountains in the dark was an entirely different challenge. The night vision goggles created a green, artificial world where depth perception was distorted and small details were difficult to distinguish. Radio towers, power lines, and other obstacles that were clearly visible during the day became nearly invisible hazards that could kill an unwary pilot. Trust your instruments, Brooks advised as they flew through a simulated mountain valley in darkness. Your eyes will lie to you at night, especially when you are tired and stressed. Your altimeter and terrain-following radar will keep you alive when your vision fails. They practiced low-level flying for another hour, simulating the kind of approach they would use to reach the target area without being detected by enemy radar. It was demanding, concentration-intensive flying that required constant attention to multiple instruments while maintaining precise aircraft control. Finally, they returned to base and landed. As Sarah climbed down from the cockpit, she realized that her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cool evening air. Her hands were shaking slightly from the combination of fatigue and adrenaline. Her mind was spinning with new information about aircraft systems, weapons employment, and tactical procedures. Get some rest, Brooks advised as they walked back toward the operations building. Tomorrow we will practice the actual mission profile. We will fly the exact route, practice the timing, and coordinate with the SEAL ground team. It is going to be more challenging than anything we did today. Sarah nodded, too tired to say much. As she walked back to her quarters, she thought about the 3 Americans sitting in their mountain prison, probably wondering if anyone was coming to help them. She thought about the SEALs who were training just as hard as she was, preparing to risk their lives climbing mountains and fighting through caves. She thought about the families back home who would never know how close their loved ones came to dying in a place most people could not find on a map. But mostly, she thought about the A-10 Thunderbolt. It was not a glamorous aircraft. It was not fast or sleek or impressive to look at, but it was honest. It was built to do a specific job, and it did that job without compromise or apology. Tomorrow, she would learn whether she could do her job with the same level of competence and dedication. The lives of American hostages and American soldiers would depend on her ability to master an aircraft she had never flown before and execute tactics she had never practiced. There was no room for error, no time for second chances, and no option for failure. The clock was ticking, and 3 American lives hung in the balance. Day 2 began before sunrise with a mission briefing that felt more real than any training Sarah had ever experienced. The conference room was packed with SEALs, pilots, intelligence specialists, and command staff. Captain Rodriguez stood at the front with a series of detailed maps and satellite photos that showed every ridge, valley, and potential threat in their target area. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is it," Rodriguez announced. "Tomorrow morning, we execute Operation Homecoming. 3 American lives depend on everything we do in the next 36 hours. Sarah sat in the front row with the other pilots, her notebook open and ready. Around her, the SEALs listened with the focused intensity of men who had done this kind of operation before. But she could see the tension in their faces. This mission was more complex and dangerous than most. "Intelligence update," Rodriguez continued, clicking to a new satellite image. "The compound sits on a ridge at 8,000 feet elevation. It is surrounded by caves and defensive positions that have been reinforced over the past 6 months. Enemy strength is estimated at 40 to 60 fighters armed with small arms, rocket-propelled grenades, and at least 2 heavy machine guns." The image showed a cluster of stone buildings surrounded by rocky terrain that looked like a medieval fortress. Sarah could see why the terrorists had chosen this location. The compound commanded views of all the surrounding valleys. Any approaching force would be visible from miles away. The only way to reach it was up a narrow trail that wound back and forth across the mountainside, providing perfect opportunities for ambushes. "The hostages are being held in this building," Rodriguez said, pointing to a structure in the center of the compound. "Our sources indicate they are kept under guard at all times, but they appear to be in reasonable health. The terrorists have demanded $10 million and the release of prisoners from Guantanamo Bay. The deadline for their demands is 36 hours from now." Sarah studied the target building carefully. It was made of stone like the others, with thick walls and small windows. Getting the hostages out would require the SEALs to fight their way through the entire compound, locate the right building, and extract 3 civilians who might be injured or unable to move quickly, all while under fire from defenders who knew the terrain better than anyone. "Ground approach will be via helicopter insertion at Landing Zone Alpha," Rodriguez explained, switching to a topographical map. "The LZ is 3 kilometers from the target, which gives us the element of surprise, but requires a difficult approach march through mountainous terrain. The assault team will consist of 12 SEALs divided into 3 4-man fire teams." Sarah looked at the proposed landing zone. It was a small flat area surrounded by peaks that rose several thousand feet higher. Flying helicopters into that kind of terrain at night would require exceptional pilot skill and perfect weather conditions. If the wind was wrong or clouds moved in, the entire mission could be compromised before it even began. "Air support will be provided by 4 A-10 aircraft," Rodriguez continued, turning towards Sarah and her fellow pilots. "Call signs Hawkeye 1 through Hawkeye 4. Your primary mission is to suppress enemy defensive positions and provide close air support during the extraction phase. Secondary mission is to provide cover for the helicopter extraction once the hostages are secured." Major Brooks stood up to address the pilots directly. "The terrain makes this extremely challenging from an aviation perspective. The compound sits in a valley surrounded by peaks that rise to 12,000 feet. Weather at that altitude is unpredictable. Winds can shift from calm to violent in minutes. Cloud cover can drop to ground level without warning." Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she listened to the tactical challenges. Everything about this mission pushed the limits of what was possible with current aircraft and training. They would be flying low-level attack runs in mountain valleys where a single mistake could result in controlled flight into terrain. They would be operating in an environment where enemy fighters could appear from caves without warning. They would be coordinating with ground forces while managing complex airspace and weapons employment. "Timeline is critical," Rodriguez emphasized. "H-hour is 0545 tomorrow morning. That gives us approximately 15 minutes of civil twilight before full sunrise. The assault team needs to be in position and ready to move at first light. Air support needs to be overhead and ready to engage targets immediately upon call from the ground commander. The operations officer brought up a detailed timeline on the projection screen. Every minute of the mission was planned and coordinated. Helicopter takeoff times, air support arrival over target, ground team movement schedules, backup plans for various contingencies. Sarah realized that dozens of people had worked for days to create this level of detail and coordination. Weather forecast is marginal, announced the meteorologist. Scattered clouds with bases at 9,000 feet. Winds from the west at 15 to 25 knots with gusts to 40 knots. Visibility 10 miles except in cloud cover. Temperature at target elevation will be approximately 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Sarah made notes about the weather conditions. Flying in mountains was challenging enough in perfect weather. Adding wind, clouds, and freezing temperatures would make aircraft handling more difficult and reduce the margin for error even further. Communications plan, said the communications officer. Ground team will use call sign Python. Air support uses Hawkeye call signs. Emergency frequency is 243.0. All aircraft will monitor guard frequency in addition to primary tactical frequency. For the next 3 hours, they went through every aspect of the mission in excruciating detail. Approach routes, target identification procedures, rules of engagement, emergency procedures, contingency plans if the weather was worse than forecast, alternate extraction sites if the primary landing zone was compromised. Sarah's head was spinning by the time they broke for lunch. The amount of planning and coordination required for a mission like this was staggering. Every possible scenario had been considered. Every potential failure point had backup plans. But she knew that no plan survived contact with the enemy, and tomorrow morning they would face situations that no one had anticipated. After lunch, it was time for the full mission rehearsal. The pilots and SEALs would practice the entire operation using a training range that had been configured to simulate the actual target area. Mountains had been marked with flags to represent the actual terrain. Buildings had been constructed to match the satellite photos of the compound. Radio operators would simulate enemy communications and defensive responses. Sarah walked out to her A-10 with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was as close to the real mission as they could get without actually flying to Afghanistan. Everything they did for the next 6 hours would be practiced exactly as they planned to execute it tomorrow. Hawkeye flight. This is Hawkeye 1, Sarah called over the radio as all 4 aircraft started their engines. Radio check. Hawkeye 2. Hawkeye 3. Hawkeye 4. All Hawkeyes, taxi for takeoff. We have good weather and clear skies for our rehearsal. Let's make this count. The 4 A-10s taxied to the runway in formation. Sarah was designated as flight leader, which meant she was responsible for coordinating the air support for the entire mission. It was a significant responsibility, but she had demonstrated good tactical judgment during the previous day's training. Tower, Hawkeye, flight of 4, ready for departure. Hawkeye flight, cleared for takeoff, winds calm. Sarah advanced her throttles and began the takeoff roll. Behind her, the other 3 aircraft followed at appropriate intervals. Once airborne, they formed up in a tactical formation that would allow them to provide mutual support while maintaining separation for weapons employment. The flight to the training range took 20 minutes, which was the same amount of time it would take to reach the actual target tomorrow. Sarah used the time to review her checklist and mentally rehearse the attack procedures they had practiced the day before. By the time they arrived over the target area, she wanted every switch position and every radio frequency memorized. Python 6, this is Hawkeye 1, Sarah called as they approached the training range. Flight of 4 A-10s checking in. We have 30 minutes of playtime and full ordnance load. Hawkeye 1, Python 6. Good to have you overhead. We are beginning our approach to the target area. Stand by for initial target briefing. Sarah looked down at the simulated compound below. Even though she knew it was just a training range, the similarity to the satellite photos was remarkable. The training staff had done an excellent job creating a realistic environment for the rehearsal. Hawkeye 1, Python 6. We have enemy personnel in defensive positions along the ridge line, approximately 400 meters north of the compound. Request immediate suppression to allow our approach. Sarah studied the terrain below, looking for the targets the ground commander had described. She could see muzzle flashes from blank ammunition being fired by role players representing enemy defenders. The flashes gave her reference points for where the actual threats would be located during the real mission. Python 6, Hawkeye 1 has visual on enemy positions. Confirm friendlies are clear of target area. Hawkeye 1, all friendlies are clear. You're cleared hot. Sarah rolled into her attack run, selecting cluster bombs from her weapons panel. The CBU, 87 cluster bombs were designed specifically for attacking personnel in the open, which made them ideal for suppressing defensive positions. She lined up her attack heading and released 2 bombs at the appropriate range. Good hits, Hawkeye 1, call the ground controller. Target area is suppressed. Continue to monitor for additional threats. The rehearsal continued for 6 hours, with the SEALs practicing their assault while the pilots provided continuous air support. They practiced multiple scenarios. What to do if the helicopters were shot down, what to do if the ground team was pinned down by enemy fire, what to do if the hostages were moved to a different building during the assault. Each scenario required different tactics and different coordination between air and ground forces. Sarah found herself constantly adjusting her position, changing weapons, and communicating with multiple radio operators simultaneously. The mental workload was intense, but she began to develop confidence in her ability to manage the complex tactical situation. As the sun was setting, they flew the final phase of the mission, covering the helicopter extraction. This was perhaps the most critical part of the operation, because the helicopters would be vulnerable to enemy fire while they landed and loaded the hostages and assault team. This is the most dangerous part, Major Brooks had warned during the briefing. The helicopters will be on the ground for approximately 3 minutes. During those 3 minutes, you need to keep every enemy fighter suppressed while avoiding hitting the good guys. There will be a lot of people moving around in a small area, and it will be easy to make a mistake. Sarah practiced the extraction phase repeatedly, coordinating with simulated helicopter pilots and ground controllers. The timing had to be perfect, too early, and they would reveal the extraction site to enemy defenders. Too late, and the helicopters would be shot down before they could land. Hawkeye 1, this is Dustoff 1, called the simulated helicopter pilot. Inbound to LZ Alpha, 2 minutes out. Dustoff 1, Hawkeye 1. LZ appears clear at this time. Will provide cover during your approach. Sarah positioned her flight to provide overlapping fields of fire around the landing zone, while maintaining enough separation to avoid hitting each other or the helicopters. It was complex, three-dimensional thinking that required her to track multiple aircraft while maintaining situational awareness of ground threats. Finally, the rehearsal was complete. All 4 A-10s returned to base as darkness fell across the mountains. As Sarah climbed down from her cockpit, she felt more confident about the mission than she had that morning. The rehearsal had identified several potential problems and allowed them to practice solutions. More importantly, it had given the pilots and ground team experience working together as a coordinated unit. How do you feel about tomorrow? Major Brooks asked as they walked back toward the operations building. Scared but ready, Sarah replied honestly. There are a lot of things that could go wrong, but I think we have prepared as well as possible. That is the right attitude, Brooks said. Confidence is good, but overconfidence will get you killed. Remember that the enemy gets a vote in how this mission unfolds. They will do things we do not expect, and we will have to adapt in real time. That evening, Sarah attended the final mission briefing. Captain Rodriguez went through the plan one more time, emphasizing the critical timing and coordination required for success. Intelligence reported that the hostages were still alive, but their condition was deteriorating. The terrorists had released a video showing one of the engineers with visible injuries, apparently from beatings. This is our last chance, Rodriguez concluded. If we do not get them out tomorrow, They will be executed on live television. Failure is not an option. After the briefing, Sarah returned to her quarters to prepare her equipment and try to get some sleep. But her mind was racing with thoughts about the mission ahead. She reviewed her checklists one more time, double-checked her survival gear, and wrote a letter to her parents that she hoped they would never have to read. As she lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, Sarah thought about the 3 Americans who were spending their last night in captivity. They probably could not sleep either, wondering if anyone was coming to rescue them or if they would die in a place far from home. She thought about their families, who were probably gathered around telephones waiting for news. She thought about the SEALs who would be climbing mountains before dawn, risking their lives for people they had never met. Most of all, she thought about her responsibility as the flight leader for the air support mission. 12 SEALs and 3 hostages would be counting on her tactical decisions and flying skills. If she made a mistake, good people would die. If she succeeded, 15 Americans would go home to their families. The clock beside her bunk showed 2,230 hours. In less than 7 hours, she would be climbing into her aircraft for the most important mission of her career. Outside her window, she could hear the sound of helicopters and other aircraft being prepared for the operation. Across the base, mechanics were loading weapons and checking systems. Intelligence specialists were monitoring communications for any last-minute changes in the enemy situation. Medical personnel were preparing to treat casualties. Everyone was doing their part to make the mission successful. Tomorrow morning, Sarah Chun would do hers. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that the next time she saw darkness, either 15 Americans would be free or a lot of good people would be dead. Sarah's alarm went off at 0330, but she had been awake for the past hour, listening to the sounds of aircraft engines warming up outside her window. The pre-mission briefing was scheduled for 0400, which gave her just enough time to shower, dress, and grab a quick breakfast before the most important 30 minutes of planning in her military career. The mess hall was nearly empty at this hour, but she forced herself to eat something substantial. Her grandmother had always said that you should never do important work on an empty stomach, and flying a combat mission in the mountains of Afghanistan definitely qualified as important work. The coffee was strong and hot, exactly what she needed to clear her head and focus on the challenges ahead. The final briefing was held in the same room where she had first volunteered for this mission 3 days earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different now. Where before there had been nervous energy and uncertainty, now there was grim determination and professional confidence. Everyone knew their job. Everyone understood the risks. Everyone was committed to bringing the hostages home alive. Weather update, announced the meteorologist. Conditions at the target area are marginal but acceptable. Scattered clouds with bases at 8,000 feet, tops at 12,000. Winds from the northwest at 20 to 30 knots with gusts to 45. Visibility is currently 10 miles, but expect rapid changes as the sun comes up. Sarah made notes about the weather conditions. The wind would make low-level flying more challenging, especially in the mountain valleys where turbulence could be severe. The cloud cover meant that she might have to operate below the weather at times, which would limit her maneuvering options and make her more vulnerable to ground fire. Intelligence update, said the operations officer. Satellite imagery from 2 hours ago shows normal activity at the compound. No indication that our approach has been detected. Enemy strength remains estimated at 40 to 60 fighters. The hostages appear to be held in the same building we identified yesterday. Captain Rodriguez stepped forward to address the assault team. Gentlemen, this is what we have trained for. In 90 minutes, we will be airborne and heading toward the target. I want everyone to remember that we are not just rescuing 3 Americans. We are sending a message to every terrorist organization in the world that Americans do not abandon their own people. The SEALs nodded silently. Sarah could see the focus in their eyes, the mental preparation that came before dangerous operations. These were men who had done this kind of work before, but she knew that every mission was different, and every mission carried the risk of death or serious injury. Air support briefing, announced Major Brooks. Hawkeye flight will depart at 0500 and arrive over the target area at 0540. Primary targets are defensive positions on the ridge line and any enemy reinforcements that attempt to reach the compound during the assault. Rules of engagement are weapons-free on any armed personnel in the target area, but confirm target identification before firing. Sarah reviewed her attack routes one final time. She would approach the target from the east, using a mountain ridge to mask her approach until the last moment. Her wingmen would approach from the west, providing overlapping coverage of the compound and surrounding defensive positions. The other two aircraft would orbit higher, ready to engage targets of opportunity or provide emergency support if one of the low-level aircraft was shot down. Medical briefing, said the flight surgeon. We have a trauma team standing by at Bagram Air Base for immediate treatment of casualties. Flight time from target to Bagram is 45 minutes. We also have 2 combat medics embedded with the assault team for treatment of injuries in the field. The briefing concluded with a final review of communication procedures and emergency protocols. Sarah synchronized her watch with the mission timeline and checked her survival equipment one last time. Everything had to be perfect because there would be no opportunity to go back and fix mistakes once the mission began. At 0445, Sarah walked out to the flight line with her 3 fellow pilots. The morning air was cold and crisp with a light wind that carried the smell of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid. Her 10 sat under the glare of floodlights, fully loaded with ordnance and ready for combat. The ground crew had been working all night to ensure that every system was functioning perfectly. "Good luck, Lieutenant," said her crew chief as she conducted her pre-flight inspection. "Bring our people home." Sarah nodded and continued her walk-around inspection of the aircraft. Every external surface, every weapon, every system component received her careful attention. She had flown this particular aircraft for the past 2 days, and she knew its quirks and characteristics better than any other A-10 in the squadron. "Hawkeye flight. This is Hawkeye 1, she called over the radio as she strapped herself into the ejection seat. "Radio check and status report. Hawkeye 2 up and ready. Hawkeye 3 up and ready. Hawkeye 4 up and ready." Sarah started her engines and ran through the pre-flight checklist with methodical precision. Every switch, every gauge, every system indicator received her attention. The A-10 was a reliable aircraft, but combat missions in mountain terrain pushed every component to its limits. A single system failure could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. At exactly 0500, Hawkeye flight taxied to the runway for takeoff. Sarah could see the SEALs boarding their helicopters on the other side of the flight line. In a few minutes, both air and ground elements would be airborne and heading toward the most dangerous mission any of them had ever attempted. Tower, Hawkeye flight of 4, ready for departure. Hawkeye flight, cleared for takeoff. Winds are northwest at 25, gusting to 35. Have a safe mission and bring everyone home. Sarah advanced her throttles to full power and began her takeoff roll. The A-10 accelerated smoothly down the runway, and at rotation speed, she pulled back gently on the stick. The aircraft lifted off cleanly and began climbing toward their cruise altitude of 15,000 feet. The flight to the target area took 40 minutes, which gave Sarah time to review her attack procedures and mentally rehearse the complex coordination that would be required once they arrived over the compound. She monitored multiple radio frequencies, staying informed about the progress of the helicopter-borne assault team and any changes in the tactical situation. Hawkeye 1, this is Python 6, came a transmission from the SEAL ground commander as they approached the target area. We are 30 minutes out from insertion. Target area appears quiet at this time. Python 6, Hawkeye 1. Flight of 4 A-10s checking in with full ordnance load and 45 minutes of playtime. Standing by for your call. Sarah could see the target compound in the distance, a cluster of stone buildings perched on a rocky ridge exactly as the satellite photos had shown. The morning sun was just beginning to illuminate the surrounding peaks, creating long shadows that would provide both concealment and challenges for target identification. Hawkeye 1, Python 6. We are beginning our insertion now. Expect to be in position for assault in 20 minutes. Sarah watched through her binoculars as the helicopters approached their landing zone 3 kilometers from the compound. The pilots were flying an extremely challenging approach, threading their aircraft through mountain valleys and using terrain features to avoid detection by enemy observers. One mistake could result in a helicopter crash that would compromise the entire mission. The helicopters landed successfully and quickly unloaded their passengers before departing the area. Sarah could not see the SEALs on the ground, but she knew they were beginning their approach march toward the compound. For the next 20 minutes, she would orbit the target area and watch for any signs that their presence had been detected. Hawkeye 1, Python 6. We are in position and ready to begin assault. Request immediate suppression of defensive positions on the North Ridge. Sarah had been waiting for this call. She rolled her aircraft into a steep dive toward the target area, selecting cluster bombs from her weapons panel. The defensive positions were clearly visible now as enemy fighters began firing at the approaching SEALs. Muzzle flashes marked their locations like strobe lights in the morning twilight. Python 6, Hawkeye 1 is in hot. Confirm all friendlies are clear of target area. Hawkeye 1, all friendlies are clear. You are cleared hot. Sarah lined up her attack run and released 2 cluster bombs at the defensive positions. The bombs exploded in a series of smaller explosions that covered the entire ridge line with lethal fragmentation. She could see secondary explosions as enemy ammunition supplies were hit by the bomblets. Excellent hits, Hawkeye 1, called the ground controller. Enemy positions are suppressed. Continue to monitor for additional targets. The assault was proceeding according to plan. Sarah could hear radio traffic from the SEAL teams as they fought their way through the compound, clearing buildings and searching for the hostages. But she knew that the enemy would be calling for reinforcements and preparing counterattacks to retake their position. Hawkeye 2, this is Hawkeye 1. I have movement on the southeast ridge. Looks like enemy reinforcements approaching the compound. Hawkeye 1, Hawkeye 2 has them visual. Approximately 20 personnel with small arms. Request permission to engage. Sarah studied the approaching enemy force through her aircraft's targeting system. They were moving tactically, using cover and concealment as they approached the compound. But they were clearly armed and moving with hostile intent toward the location where American forces were operating. Hawkeye 2, you are cleared to engage enemy reinforcements. Use cannon to conserve ordnance. Hawkeye 2 rolled into an attack run and opened fire with the GU-8 cannon. The distinctive sound of the 30mm rounds could be heard even above the noise of aircraft engines. Sarah watched as the enemy formation was decimated by the accurate cannon fire. Python 6, Hawkeye 1. Enemy reinforcements on Southeast Ridge have been neutralized. How is your progress in the compound? Hawkeye 1. We have located the hostages. All 3 are alive, but one requires immediate medical attention. We are beginning extraction now. Request cover for our movement to the landing zone. This was the most critical phase of the mission. The SEALs would have to move 3 kilometers across difficult terrain while carrying an injured hostage. Enemy forces in the area would be converging on their position, and the rescue helicopters would be vulnerable during the pickup operation. Python 6, Hawkeye 1 understands you are beginning movement to extraction site. We will provide continuous overhead cover. Report any threats or obstacles. For the next 20 minutes, Sarah and her wingmen flew tactical patterns around the SEAL team's route of movement. They could not see the Americans on the ground, but they maintained communication and watched for any enemy forces that might interfere with the extraction. Hawkeye 1, Python 6. We have reached the landing zone and are setting up security. Dust-off birds are inbound 5 minutes out. Sarah could see the extraction helicopters approaching from the east, flying low and fast through the mountain valleys. The pilots were pushing their aircraft to the limits of performance, knowing that every second on the ground increased the risk of being shot down by enemy fire. Dustoff 1, Hawkeye 1. Landing zone appears clear at this time. Will provide cover during your approach and landing. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Sarah watched as the SEAL team quickly loaded the 3 hostages and prepared for immediate departure. But as the second helicopter approached, she saw muzzle flashes from a ridge line overlooking the landing zone. Dustoff 1, taking fire from the North Ridge. Recommend immediate departure. Hawkeye 3, Hawkeye 1. I need immediate suppression of enemy positions on North Ridge, approximately 1 kilometer north of the LZ. Hawkeye 1, Hawkeye 3 isn't hot. Hawkeye 3 dove toward the enemy positions and engaged them with rockets and cannon fire. The attack was accurate and effective, silencing the enemy fire just as the helicopters lifted off with their precious cargo. Dustoff 1 airborne with package secure. Came the call that Sarah had been waiting to hear. All hostages recovered and en route to medical treatment. Sarah felt a surge of relief and satisfaction that was unlike anything she had experienced in her military career. After 3 days of intensive preparation and training, the mission had been executed flawlessly. 3 Americans who had been condemned to death were now free and heading home to their families. Outstanding work, Hawkeye Flight. Came a transmission from Captain Rodriguez. Mission accomplished. All elements return to base. As Sarah turned her aircraft toward home, she reflected on everything that had happened over the past 72 hours. She had volunteered for a mission that terrified her. She had learned to fly an aircraft she had never touched before. She had mastered tactics and procedures that were completely outside her previous experience. She had worked with ground forces in the kind of coordinated operation that required absolute trust and professional competence. Most importantly, she had proven to herself that she could rise to meet any challenge when American lives were at stake. The SEALs had asked for battle pilots who could think like ground fighters. They had asked for aviators who understood that every bullet they fired might save the life of someone fighting on the ground. Sarachin had answered that call, and she had delivered exactly what was needed when it was needed most. As Hawkeye Flight approached their home base, Sarah could see crowds of people gathered on the flight line. Word of the mission's success had obviously spread, and everyone wanted to welcome the returning heroes. But Sarah knew that the real heroes were the SEALs who had climbed mountains and fought through enemy positions to reach 3 terrified Americans. She had simply done her job as a United States Air Force pilot. But sometimes doing your job was the most heroic thing you could possibly do. The mission was complete. The hostages were free, and Sarah Chun had found her true calling as a combat pilot who would never walk away from a challenge that mattered. 3 months after Operation Homecoming, Sarah Chun stood in the Pentagon briefing room facing a panel of senior officers who would determine the future of close air support tactics in the United States military. The success of the hostage rescue mission had attracted attention from the highest levels of command, and now they wanted to understand how a fighter pilot with no previous A-10 experience had managed to coordinate such a complex operation with only 3 days of training. Lieutenant Chun, said General Patricia Williams, the 4-star commander of Air Combat Command, your after-action reports from Operation Homecoming have been studied by tactical development specialists throughout the Air Force. We would like you to explain how your background in air-to-air combat translated to close air support operations. Sarah had been preparing for this briefing for weeks, but she still felt nervous standing before some of the most senior leaders in the military. These were officers who made decisions that affected thousands of pilots and millions of dollars in aircraft procurement. What she said in the next 30 minutes could influence how the Air Force trained pilots for decades to come. Ma'am, I believe the key factor was not my previous flying experience, but the quality of training and preparation provided by the special operations community, Sarah replied. Major Brooks and Captain Rodriguez created a learning environment that compressed months of normal training into 3 intensive days. General Williams nodded and made notes on her tablet. But surely your background in tactical flying gave you advantages that a new pilot would not have had. Yes, ma'am. To some extent, Sarah agreed. Understanding aircraft systems and basic flight safety procedures allowed me to focus on learning SAS-specific tactics rather than basic airmanship. But the most important factor was the integrated training approach that combined air and ground elements from the beginning. What Sarah did not mention was how the experience had changed her perspective on military aviation. Before Operation Homecoming, she had seen flying as an individual challenge that required technical mastery and competitive excellence. Now, she understood that combat aviation was fundamentally about teamwork and supporting people whose lives depended on your professional competence. The mission reports indicate that you served as flight leader for the air support element, noted General Williams. How did you prepare for that level of responsibility with such limited experience in the aircraft? Sarah thought carefully about her answer. The truth was that she had been terrified of making a mistake that would get people killed. But she had channeled that fear into obsessive preparation and constant communication with the ground team. Ma'am, I approached it by focusing on the fundamentals rather than trying to be perfect, she said. I made sure I understood the ground commander's intent, maintained constant situational awareness, and communicated clearly with all elements of the mission. The specific aircraft systems were less important than understanding how air support fits into the overall tactical plan. After the briefing, Sarah walked through the corridors of the Pentagon thinking about how much her career had changed since volunteering for that mission. She had been promoted to captain and assigned to the Air Force Special Operations Command, where she now trained other pilots in the integration of air and ground operations. Her experience with Operation Homecoming had become a case study used at the Air Force Weapons School and the Navy Top Gun program. But the most important change was not professional. It was personal. Sarah had discovered that her greatest satisfaction as a military officer came from missions where her flying skills directly contributed to saving American lives. The academic precision of air-to-air combat had been replaced by the immediate urgency of supporting troops in contact with the enemy. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Captain Rodriguez, who had been promoted to major and assigned to lead a new joint task force focused on developing rapid response capabilities for hostage rescue operations. Chen, we have a situation developing in Somalia. 3 State Department personnel taken hostage by pirates. Can you be ready to deploy in 6 hours? Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with emergency mission alerts. She had been through this process 7 times since Operation Homecoming, and each mission had presented unique challenges that required creative solutions and flawless execution. Roger that, sir. I'll be ready in 4 hours, she replied. As she drove back to Andrews Air Force Base, Sarah reflected on the 3 Americans they had rescued from that mountain compound in Afghanistan. All 3 had recovered from their ordeal and returned to their families. The engineer who had been injured during captivity had required several months of physical therapy, but he was now working on school construction projects in Africa. The other 2 had returned to Afghanistan within 6 months to continue their development work, despite the trauma they had experienced. Their courage in returning to dangerous work had inspired Sarah to think differently about risk and service. If civilian engineers were willing to build schools in hostile territory, how could military pilots be any less committed to supporting missions that made the world safer for innocent people? Her apartment near the base had become a study center filled with tactical manuals, aircraft specifications, and mission planning software. Where other pilots collected model aircraft and aviation art, Sarah collected case studies of successful rescue operations and joint air-ground coordination. She had become a student of the art of saving lives through precision application of air power. The doorbell rang as she was packing her deployment gear. Outside stood Master Sergeant Jennifer Torres, the SEAL team medic who had treated the hostages during Operation Homecoming. Torres had been wounded in a subsequent operation and was now assigned to a training unit while recovering from her injuries. Captain Chun, I heard you were deploying again, Torres said. I wanted to give you something before you left. She handed Sarah a small wooden plaque with an engraved inscription. To Captain Sarah Chun, whose courage and skill brought 3 Americans home. From the families of Thomas Mitchell, David Park, and Maria Santos. Sarah felt a tightness in her throat as she read the names of the hostages they had rescued. For months, they had been abstract objectives in a tactical problem. But they were real people with families who had been waiting for news and hoping for miracles. How are they doing? Sarah asked. All 3 are doing well, Torres replied. Mitchell is back in Afghanistan building schools. Park is working for an engineering firm in Seattle and volunteers with veteran support organizations. Santos got married last month and invited the entire rescue team to the wedding. Sarah looked at the plaque and thought about the impact that 72 hours of preparation and 15 minutes of combat operations had created. 3 families had been reunited. 3 careers had been restored. 3 people who might have died in a mountain compound were now living full lives and contributing to their communities. There's something else, Torres continued. The 3 of them have established a scholarship fund for military children who want to study aviation or engineering. They specifically requested that it be named the Hawkeye Foundation after your call sign during the mission. Sarah was overwhelmed by the gesture. She had been doing her job as a military pilot, following orders and applying her training to accomplish an assigned mission. But for the people they had rescued, it represented something much more significant. That's incredible, Sarah said. I don't know what to say. Say you'll keep doing what you're doing, Torres replied. There are a lot of Americans in dangerous places around the world who might need you to stand up and volunteer when their lives are on the line. 2 hours later, Sarah was airborne in an A-10 heading toward Somalia with 3 other pilots and a full complement of special operations personnel. The mission briefing had been familiar, but unique. Pirates holding hostages on a ship off the coast, demanding ransom and threatening to execute their captives if their demands were not met. As she flew through the darkness over the Atlantic Ocean, Sarah thought about all the people who had contributed to her development as a combat pilot. Major Brooks, who had taught her that close air support was about patience and precision rather than speed and aggression. Captain Rodriguez, who had shown her that military leadership meant being willing to risk everything for the safety of innocent people. The SEALs who had demonstrated that true professionals could accomplish impossible missions through training, teamwork, and determination. Most of all, she thought about the moment when she had stood up in that briefing room and volunteered for a mission that terrified her. That decision had changed the trajectory of her career and her life. It had led her to discover capabilities she never knew she possessed and to find meaning in her military service that went far beyond personal advancement or professional recognition. The radio crackled with updated intelligence from the mission commander. The hostages were being held on a cargo ship anchored 12 miles off the Somali coast. The pirates were armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. They had threatened to kill 1 hostage every 6 hours until their demands were met. Hawkeye 1, this is Crusader 6, came the familiar voice of Major Rodriguez. Are you ready to do this again? Sarah checked her weapons systems and reviewed her approach routes one final time. Below her, the dark waters of the Indian Ocean stretched toward a horizon where 3 more Americans were waiting for rescue. Somewhere ahead, enemy fighters were prepared to kill innocent people for money and ideology. But between the hostages and their captors stood a team of American Special Operations personnel who had dedicated their lives to missions that others considered impossible. And providing air support for that team was Captain Sarah Chun, a pilot who had learned that the most important battles were not fought for glory or recognition, but for the simple principle that Americans do not abandon their own people. Crusader 6, Hawkeye 1, Sarah replied. We are locked and loaded and ready to bring our people home. The mission ahead will be dangerous. The odds would not be perfect. The enemy would be determined and well prepared. But Sarah Chun was no longer the nervous fighter pilot who had stood up in a briefing room 3 months earlier. She was a combat-tested close air support specialist who understood that her job was not to be a hero. Her job was to provide the precise application of air power that would allow other heroes to accomplish their mission and return home safely. She had found her calling in the mountains of Afghanistan, and she would never walk away from it again. The rescue was about to begin, and Captain Sarah Chun was exactly where she belonged, in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt, ready to fight for people she had never met but would never abandon. 3 more Americans were counting on her professional competence and personal courage, and she would not let them down. The sun was rising over the Indian Ocean, painting the sky in shades of gold and red. It was going to be a beautiful day for a rescue operation. Sarah smiled and pushed her throttles forward, accelerating toward another impossible mission that would somehow become possible through the dedication and skill of American warriors who refused to accept failure as an option. The legend of the SEAL captain who asked for battle pilots and the Air Force lieutenant who slowly stood tall was just beginning, and it would inspire a new generation of military aviators to understand that true greatness comes not from what you accomplish for yourself, but from what you accomplish for others. The call sign Hawkeye 1 would become synonymous with courage, precision, and the unbreakable commitment to bringing Americans home from the most dangerous places on Earth.